Before I tell you how Boeing's own engineers tried to stop the 737 MAX from flying, you need to hear the text message that one Boeing pilot sent just months before 346 people died. What he wrote will shock you, but it also reveals how a company that once defined safety chose profits over lives. And here's what makes this story even more disturbing. The FAA knew about the problems and let the planes keep flying anyway. Good evening, and welcome to Case Vault. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand how one of America's most trusted companies sacrificed a century of safety reputation for quarterly earnings. Tonight, we're examining the Boeing 737 MAX crisis. Not just the crashes, but the corporate cover-up that nearly destroyed the aviation industry forever. This is the story of how Boeing's rush to compete with Airbus led to the deadliest corporate scandal in aviation history. This case involves two catastrophic crashes that killed 346 people, internal emails that Boeing tried to hide from investigators, and a certification process so corrupt that it changed how aircraft are approved worldwide. But here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. Boeing's own test pilots knew the planes were dangerous, yet the company continued selling them to airlines around the world. To understand why this matters so much, you need to know that Boeing had never had a commercial airliner banned from flying in the company's 102-year history. The 737 MAX wasn't just grounded. It was the first time in decades that every airline in the world was ordered to stop flying a specific aircraft model. This wasn't just a business failure. It was a complete breakdown of the safety culture that had made commercial aviation the safest form of transportation in history. But before we get to those text messages, I need to take you back to 2010, when Boeing faced an existential threat that would change the company forever. Airbus, Boeing's European rival, had just launched the A320neo, an aircraft that was winning orders from airlines around the world. Boeing's response would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately kill 346 people. Boeing was at a crossroads. They could design an entirely new aircraft to compete with the A320neo, which would take 10 to 15 years and cost tens of billions of dollars. Or they could modify their existing 737 design with new, more efficient engines. The financial pressure was enormous. Boeing's stock price and executive bonuses depended on beating Airbus to market. The decision they made reveals everything about how Boeing's culture had changed over the previous decades. Instead of engineering excellence, Boeing chose financial expediency. They would put new, larger engines on the 737, engines that were too big for the aircraft's original design and would require fundamental changes to how the plane flew. Here's what Boeing executives didn't tell their customers, regulators, or even their own pilots. These new engines would make the 737 MAX inherently unstable in certain flight conditions. To compensate for this instability, Boeing would install a computer system called Mcas, Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. This system would automatically push the nose down if it detected that the plane was climbing too steeply. The Mcas system was Boeing's solution to a problem they had created. The larger engines had to be mounted higher and more forward on the 737 MAX than on previous 737 models. This changed the aerodynamics in a way that could cause the nose to pitch up dangerously during certain maneuvers, especially when the plane was climbing steeply with high thrust. But here's where Boeing made their first fatal error. They designed Mcas to rely on input from only one angle of attack sensor, rather than comparing readings from multiple sensors. If that single sensor malfunctioned and provided incorrect data, Mcas would activate inappropriately and push the nose down repeatedly, even when the aircraft was flying normally. Boeing's own engineers raised concerns about this design during development. Internal emails later revealed by congressional investigators show that some Boeing employees were worried about the system's reliance on a single sensor. One engineer wrote, "This is egregious. It's a single point of failure that could result in catastrophic consequences." But Boeing's management overruled these engineering concerns. They were under enormous pressure to get the 737 MAX certified and delivered to customers quickly. Every month of delay meant losing potential sales to Airbus. The competitive pressure had become more important than safety margins. Here's something even more disturbing. Boeing initially didn't plan to tell pilots about Mcas at all. They wanted to avoid requiring additional pilot training, which would make the 737 MAX less attractive to airlines. Airlines prefer aircraft that their pilots can fly without expensive additional training programs. This decision would prove catastrophic. Pilots flying the 737 MAX had no idea that their aircraft had a system that could automatically take control and push the nose down. When Mcas malfunctioned, pilots found themselves fighting their own airplane without understanding what was happening. On October 29, 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 took off from Jakarta, Indonesia, bound for Pangkal Pinang. The aircraft was a nearly new Boeing 737 MAX 8, delivered to Lion Air just 2 months earlier. Captain Bhavye Suneja and First Officer Harvino were experienced pilots with thousands of flight hours between them. What happened next reveals the deadly consequences of Boeing's design decisions. During the flight, the angle of attack sensor on the captain's side of the aircraft began providing erroneous readings, indicating that the plane was climbing too steeply when it was actually flying normally. Based on this false information, Mcas activated automatically and pushed the plane's nose down. Captain Suneja pulled back on the controls to raise the nose, but Mcas activated again and again, each time pushing the nose down more aggressively. The pilots found themselves in a deadly battle with their own aircraft. The cockpit voice recorder captured the confusion and desperation of the final minutes. The pilots were trying every procedure they knew, but nothing in their training had prepared them for Mcas. Boeing had never told them the system existed, much less how to disable it. Flight 610 crashed into the Java Sea just 13 minutes after takeoff, killing all 189 people on board. Indonesian investigators would later determine that the angle of attack sensor had malfunctioned, causing Mcas to activate inappropriately throughout the flight. But here's what makes this crash even more tragic. It was preventable. The day before, the same aircraft had experienced the same Mcas malfunction on a flight from Bali to Jakarta. During that flight, an off-duty pilot who was riding in the cockpit recognized what was happening and told the crew how to disable the system. The plane landed safely, but Lion Air's maintenance crew failed to properly repair the faulty sensor. Boeing's initial response to the Lion Air crash was to blame the pilots and the airline's maintenance practices. The company issued a statement emphasizing that pilots should follow existing emergency procedures. What Boeing didn't mention was that none of those procedures specifically addressed Mcas malfunctions. Internal Boeing documents later revealed by congressional investigators show that company officials knew immediately that Mcas was likely involved in the Lion Air crash, yet Boeing continued to defend the 737 MAX's safety and opposed grounding the aircraft. On March 10, 2019, less than 5 months after the Lion Air crash, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 took off from Addis Ababa, bound for Nairobi, Kenya. Captain Yared Getachew and First Officer Ahmed Noor Mohammed were flying a 737 MAX 8 that was even newer than the Lion Air aircraft. It had been delivered just 4 months earlier. By this time, Boeing had issued a bulletin to airlines worldwide about Mcas, explaining the system's existence and providing guidance on how to disable it if it malfunctioned. Ethiopian Airlines had trained their pilots on these procedures. Captain Getachew and First Officer Mohammed knew about Mcas and were prepared for a malfunction. But knowledge of the system wasn't enough to save Flight 302. Just 2 minutes after takeoff, the aircraft's angle of attack sensor began providing false readings, triggering Mcas activation. The pilots immediately recognized what was happening and attempted to follow Boeing's recommended procedures. The cockpit voice recorder shows that the Ethiopian pilots performed exactly as Boeing had instructed after the Lion Air crash. They disabled the electric trim system that controlled Mcas and attempted to manually adjust the aircraft's trim using backup controls. But Boeing's procedures had a fatal flaw. At the speed and altitude where Flight 302 encountered the Mcas malfunction, the manual trim controls were almost impossible to operate due to the tremendous aerodynamic forces on the aircraft. The pilots found themselves unable to regain control despite following Boeing's own emergency procedures. Flight 302 crashed just 6 minutes after takeoff, killing all 157 people on board. The similarity to the Lion Air crash was undeniable. Both accidents involved new 737 MAX aircraft. Both were caused by Mcas malfunctions triggered by faulty angle of attack sensors, and both resulted in crashes despite the pilots' attempts to regain control. The Ethiopian Airlines crash changed everything. Airlines around the world began grounding their 737 MAX fleets voluntarily. Country after country banned the aircraft from their airspace. Boeing's customers were no longer willing to trust Boeing's assurances about the aircraft's safety. As investigators dug deeper into the 737 MAX crashes, they uncovered a pattern of deception and cover-up that reached the highest levels of Boeing's management. Congressional investigations and lawsuits revealed thousands of internal Boeing communications that showed company officials knew about serious safety concerns, but chose to hide them from regulators and customers. The most damaging evidence came from text messages between Boeing test pilots. In 2016, Chief Technical Pilot Mark Faulkner sent messages to a colleague describing Mcas as egregious and admitting that he had inadvertently misled FAA regulators about the system's capabilities. In one particularly damning exchange, Faulkner wrote, "So I basically lied to the regulators, unknowingly." When his colleague asked what he meant, Faulkner explained that he had told the FAA that Mcas would only activate in rare extreme flight conditions. In reality, the system could activate during normal flight operations. But the deception went beyond individual employees. Boeing as a company had systematically downplayed Mcas's role and capabilities to avoid triggering requirements for additional pilot training. Internal presentations show that Boeing deliberately described Mcas as a minor system enhancement rather than a flight-critical safety system. Perhaps most shocking were the communications showing Boeing employees' callous attitudes toward safety concerns. In one email chain, a Boeing employee wrote, "This airplane is designed by clowns, who are in turn supervised by monkeys." Another employee joked about lying to regulators, writing, "I still haven't been forgiven by God for the covering up I did last year." These communications revealed that Boeing's problems went beyond the Mcas system itself. The company had developed a culture where financial considerations routinely overruled safety concerns, where employees felt pressured to mislead regulators, and where engineering excellence had been sacrificed for competitive advantage. The 737 MAX crisis also exposed serious problems with how aircraft are certified for safety in the United States. The Federal Aviation Administration had increasingly relied on aircraft manufacturers to police themselves through a program called Organization Designation Authorization, ODA. Under this program, Boeing was allowed to use its own employees to conduct many of the safety assessments and tests that had previously been performed by FAA inspectors. In essence, Boeing was certifying the safety of its own aircraft, with minimal independent oversight from federal regulators. Congressional investigators found that Boeing had pressured its own employees who were designated as FAA representatives. These employees faced conflicts of interest between their official roles as safety assessors and their employment by Boeing. Some reported feeling pressured to approve designs quickly to meet Boeing's schedule demands. The FAA's own internal communications, revealed during congressional hearings, showed that agency officials were aware of problems with Mcas but failed to take adequate action. One FAA email stated that the agency was in over our heads regarding the 737 MAX's automated systems. Even more troubling was the revelation that the FAA had originally planned to require simulator training for 737 MAX pilots specifically because of Mcas. But Boeing lobbied against this requirement, arguing that it would make the aircraft less marketable. The FAA eventually agreed to allow computer-based training instead of hands-on simulator experience. This decision had deadly consequences. Computer-based training couldn't prepare pilots for the physical and psychological challenges of fighting Mcas during an actual emergency. The pilots who died in both crashes might have survived if they had experienced Mcas malfunctions in a simulator before encountering them in real aircraft. The 737 MAX crisis fundamentally changed how we think about aviation safety, corporate responsibility, and regulatory oversight. The crashes demonstrated that even the world's most experienced aircraft manufacturer could prioritize profits over safety when competitive pressures became intense enough. The tragedy also revealed the dangers of regulatory capture, the phenomenon where government agencies become too close to the industries they're supposed to oversee. The FAA's reliance on Boeing for self-certification created conflicts of interest that contributed directly to the deaths of 346 people. Perhaps most importantly, the 737 MAX crashes showed that technological complexity without proper training and disclosure can be deadly. Modern aircraft are incredibly sophisticated, but that sophistication means nothing if pilots don't understand how the systems work or how to respond when they malfunction. The families of the victims have become powerful advocates for aviation safety reform. Many have lobbied for stronger criminal penalties for corporate executives who conceal safety problems, better whistleblower protections for employees who report safety concerns, and more independent oversight of aircraft certification. Boeing itself has undergone significant changes since the crashes. The company has new leadership, revised safety procedures, and a stated commitment to rebuilding its safety culture. But rebuilding trust takes time, and Boeing continues to face skepticism from pilots, regulators, and the flying public. The 737 MAX story serves as a cautionary tale about what happens when short-term financial pressures override long-term safety considerations. It's a reminder that in aviation, as in many industries, the cost of cutting corners can be measured not just in dollars, but in human lives. Today, when you board a commercial aircraft, you can still trust that flying remains the safest form of transportation, but that safety depends on continued vigilance, proper regulation, and a corporate culture that puts safety first, even when it's expensive or inconvenient. Thank you for watching Case Vault. Next week, we'll examine how Tesla's autopilot promises became a nightmare for early adopters and what internal documents reveal about Elon Musk's knowledge of the system's limitations. Subscribe and hit the notification bell to make sure you don't miss this investigation into the dark side of automotive innovation. Until next time, this is Case Vault.